By the time the third storm rolled across Holmes County, the wind had taken the roof off 3 barns and frozen the creek solid. But beneath the snow-covered hill, Jacob Lapp's strange tunnel still breathed warmth, and the livestock inside were alive even though most neighbors had said it was foolishness. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories of faith, craftsmanship, and quiet endurance speak to your heart, we invite you to join us for tomorrow's tale. The first shovel of earth was turned in mid-June, long before the wheat was in, and long before anyone in the valley was thinking of winter. But Jacob Lapp was thinking of it not the coming winter, but the kind only his grandfather spoke of. The kind where the wind came not in gusts but in long howls, dragging frost through the walls and silence through the barns. He had listened to the elders, to the stories whispered in quiet tones about the blizzard of '56, when 6 families shared one hearth and 2 horses froze standing up. He'd heard them, and more importantly, he'd believed them. And so he began to dig. Neighbors passing by slowed their buggies when they saw what he was doing. A stone-lined trench angled into the side of a slope behind his barn. They didn't say much at first. A few nodded politely. 1 or 2 offered a quiet gut Marie and kept on. But the murmurs began soon after. "He's lost too many hours to ideas," old Abram King said at the market. "Maybe the boy should have stayed with cabinetry," another added, "instead of playing engineer." Jacob heard none of it, or if he did, it didn't change the way he carried his shovel. Each morning after milking, he walked behind the barn with the same quiet resolve and disappeared into the earth. His plan was simple, though it looked mad from the outside. He was digging an insulated tunnel that would connect the root cellar to the livestock barn not just for walking, but for warmth, a stone-lined artery where earth temperature could buffer the worst of the cold. He remembered how his cattle had suffered last January, the way their breath had hung in the air like fog, the way his children cried when they found one calf frozen beside the wall. He had sworn then he would not meet another winter unprepared. By mid-July, the tunnel was waist-deep and lined with river stones hauled from the creek bed, each placed by hand. He dug at an angle, letting the slope do half the insulating. Above, he built a low roof from rough pine and layered it with sod. The passage felt like something out of the old world, dark, silent, and steady. Rachel, his wife, brought him cool water and bread some days and asked only once, "Will it be worth it, Jacob?" He'd nodded and replied, "Only if I'm wrong will it be waste." By September, the tunnel was done. The cows moved through it easily, and the warmth that stayed within even on cool nights was proof enough for Jacob. Still, when the neighbors passed by, they shook their heads and called it Lapp's folly. But the frost came early that year, and with it, a silence that made everyone pay attention. The first snow fell on October 9th, 3 weeks early. It dusted the fields in the morning and clung to the window panes by nightfall. At first, no one worried. Snow came and went, but by the second storm, when the roads glazed over and the creek stopped flowing, a new kind of worry settled over the valley. The Lapps sat around the oil lamp that evening, the children quietly knitting and Rachel mending the seam of Jacob's coat. Outside, the world had gone silent, but inside, the air still held warmth, carried in from the tunnel and the heat stored in the thick stone walls of the barn. Jacob rose and opened the door to check the thermometer nailed to the porch. 10 below zero. He exhaled slowly and walked the short path through the tunnel to check the livestock. He did not need a lantern. The orange glow from the hearth in the adjacent wall, carefully vented and built low in the root cellar, gave off just enough light to guide his steps. The tunnel held at a steady 38 degrees, cold, but not killing cold. The animals stirred gently as he passed, their breath visible but not desperate. He whispered prayers over them as he worked. By contrast, the neighbors were struggling. Ruth Yoder's son had come to borrow firewood. "Our goats won't last the week," he said, rubbing his raw hands together. Jacob sent him away with wood and 2 thick wool blankets. No sermon, just quiet help. More came as the days passed. A farmer's boy with frostbitten ears. An older man looking for a place to store potatoes that wouldn't rot in the ice. Rachel said nothing each time Jacob gave away something they might later need, but each time he returned from the barn, she had the fire stoked and a bowl of stew waiting. "We will be fine," she said once. "You built for more than just us." Jacob didn't know it at the time, but word was spreading not just of his tunnel, but of its warmth. They called it strange, yes. But now, some called it miraculous. A structure not meant for show but for life, built in faith, in silence, in defiance of the expected. One morning, after the third storm, Jacob found 2 buggies waiting near the barn. Inside were 3 calves, one nearly gone. The family that brought them stood in silence, not asking, only hoping. Jacob didn't speak either. He opened the gate and led the way into the tunnel. The boy stared wide-eyed. "It's warm." Jacob only nodded. Warm enough. And so it was. By the time December arrived, the snow had turned to ice. The valley, usually so full of life, was a landscape of barren fields and still trees. Every morning was a quiet battle against the cold, as Jacob and his family dressed quickly, checked the animals, and gathered any firewood that hadn't been buried by snowdrifts. The wind howled through the valleys like a constant reminder of the storm's power, and with it, a bitter truth. The old world was waiting for its due. But in Jacob's barn, there was a quiet that was more than just the absence of noise. It was a kind of peace, an assurance that even in the depths of winter, there was warmth. Not the kind found in a roaring fire or a thick quilt, but the steady, unyielding kind that came from a place hidden, from a thought far ahead of the present moment. His tunnel, his strange, foolish tunnel, was standing guard, not just for the animals, but for the people. It was on the 18th of December when the storm hit hardest, a blizzard so fierce that even the trees seemed to bend low to the earth, as if to shield themselves from the snow. Jacob knew that others in the valley, including those who had once mocked him, were struggling. The railroad was buried in snow, the roads impassable. There was no way to get supplies. People were huddling in their cabins, burning anything they could to stay warm. But Jacob's barn remained untouched by the worst of the storm. Inside, it was like another world. The cold wind outside might rage, but inside the tunnel, the temperature held steady. The livestock shifted in their straw, warm and content, their breaths not clouding the air in desperation. Jacob walked to the back of the barn and lit a small lantern, carefully placing it beside the cattle. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for keeping us safe. May we continue to have the strength to endure." He felt the weight of the long days ahead, the coming weeks that would test the resolve of every soul in the valley. He knew that there was no guarantee his tunnel would last, no certainty that they could continue living this way. But in that moment, standing in the warm shelter of the barn, he realized that survival was not about the strength of the storm, but about the strength of what had been built in anticipation of it. Late that evening, Rachel came into the barn, a little worn but strong as ever. "Jacob," she said softly, "they're asking." "Who is?" "The Yoders. They've lost half their cattle." "They're cold, Jacob." "I don't think they'll make it through another storm." Jacob felt his heart sink. The Yoders were good people, and despite his resolve, he could not deny that his heart ached to see them suffer. But Rachel knew, as he did, that their survival wasn't just about offering shelter. It was about the long road ahead. She handed him a blanket, woven thick and solid, the kind that would hold against the worst cold. "I'll go," Jacob said quietly, as he gathered his things. He went out through the barn, the wind biting at his face, and saw 2 buggies waiting near the edge of the valley. The horses were trembling with cold, their coats frosted over. But the Yoders were waiting, eyes hopeful, yet with the sadness of desperation hanging heavy. Jacob nodded and led the way back to his barn, where the warmth of the tunnel would be shared, and more than that, the hope of enduring winter together. The storm raged for weeks, relentless and unforgiving. The valley seemed to close in on itself, as if nature was pressing its will upon the land, testing every farmer, every family, and every last structure built in the old ways. But Jacob's barn, with its stone-lined tunnel, stood as it always had, quiet, still, and steadfast. Word of Jacob's underground tunnel spread quickly. What began as whispers behind closed doors grew into stories told around hearths in the neighboring farms. Even those who had once mocked him came to see for themselves, standing at the entrance to his barn, eyes wide with wonder. They had come to see what they once called Jacob's folly. But now they saw something else. They saw a man who had prepared, a man whose foresight had outpaced them all. One morning, when the snow had finally settled, Jacob sat at the edge of his barn, looking out over the white landscape. Rachel joined him, sitting beside him in silence for a long time. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice low, as if afraid to speak the truth out loud. "I don't know," Jacob said. "But we will help where we can. We have our shelter, but others, they have nothing." Rachel nodded, looking toward the horizon where the faint outline of the Yoder farm stood. The other settlers had not fared well. Though the barns had been built sturdy, they hadn't been built for such an unforgiving winter. Jacob knew that it would take more than just his tunnel to get them through. It would take unity, faith, and a willingness to lean on one another. In the coming days, Jacob and Rachel opened their home to those in need. The Yoders, whose livestock had all but perished, stayed in the barn, kept warm by the same tunnel that had protected Jacob's cattle. They brought what little they had left, sharing food, firewood, and even clothing. More families followed, each one with stories of hardship, but also of gratitude. Jacob had not built the tunnel to save the world. He had built it because he had seen the future in his mind's eye, a future where winters like these could destroy the unprepared. What had seemed excessive to others was now a blessing. And as the weeks passed, the once critical voices turned into praise. They spoke of Jacob's foresight, of his patience and belief that sometimes the hardest work was not the one that showed immediately, but the work that saved lives long after. By February, the worst of the storm had passed, and though the earth was still locked in ice, the people of the valley were finding their way through it, helped by the warmth of Jacob's shelter and the enduring strength of their community. They had survived the hardest winter many had ever known, not because they had been strong enough to face it alone, but because they had been wise enough to help one another. Jacob stood beside the barn one last time that season, his hand resting against the stone wall that had held strong through it all. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting its first warm light on the valley in months. Rachel came to his side, looking out over the snow-dappled fields. "You know," she said, "they'll remember this, Jacob. Not just the tunnel, but how you led by example." Jacob nodded, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "I hope they remember the work. And maybe, just maybe, that building for the worst keeps us all safe." And so it was. In the years that followed, when other families faced their own storms, they remembered Jacob's tunnel. They remembered the way he had built, not for himself, but for all who would come after him. They carried on his lessons in the barns they built, in the way they leaned on each other, and in the way they prepared not for the winters they had seen, but for the ones that were still to come. Spring arrived slowly, as it always did in Holmes County, but the land was healing, just as Jacob had prayed it would. The tunnel beneath his barn, once the subject of mockery, now stood as a quiet testament to foresight and faith. Jacob had not just saved his own family, he had saved many others, and in doing so had taught them all the value of building for the unseen, of trusting in what was yet to come. Years passed, and Jacob's name became synonymous with preparation, with quiet strength. When new families came to the valley, they sought him out for advice, asking about foundations, about building in the earth's rhythm. They asked not for the grand designs they had imagined, but for the simple, humble wisdom he had followed in the face of hardship. And so it was that his tunnel, though long forgotten by most, became something of a legend, a quiet part of the valley's story, passed down through the generations. In the years to come, the people of Holmes County would not only remember the harsh winter, but also the warm hearth that had withstood it, and the man who built it, silently, for them all.